So this talks about recent legislation proposed by the New South Wales Labor government to exclude or discriminate against workers who suffered psychological injury. Basically, any event or series of events or repeated exposures at work that affects a person's mental health. So we've got exposure to trauma, as with the police, ambulance, fire and rescue, or exposure to a work accident in which the worker's life or mental health is seriously at risk. The first one tends to be repeated exposures, but we can also have one-off things. There's also such a thing as vicarious trauma, where you see something bad happen to a workmate. Say you see a workmate fall from a building site, and smash down on the concrete, or fall into a saw at work and lose a limb. So you can develop, everybody's heard of PTSD, from exposure to such trauma, especially repeated exposure. And you get a range of very disturbing symptoms. You can't get the thoughts or images of what happened out of your head. You dream about them at night, nightmares, and you have a problem with avoidance. Eventually you can't go back to the workplace, and that's what happens with a lot of police. A lot of this guy that truck overturned, he couldn't walk back through the gates. And also the person withdraws from other people. They go into a bit of a shell. The other symptoms, hyperarousal. So after you've been exposed to a dangerous situation, you're on the alert for danger. You're on the alert for threat. Whether you're driving, whether you're walking down the street, for example, if you've been attacked, you become a bit paranoid, in other words. I had a lady who worked in old person's home, and she was attacked by a person with dementia with scissors. And she didn't get stabbed, but she stabbed a woman next to her, and they all had to run away and lock themselves into the thing. And she couldn't go back into that house. And moreover, when she was out in public, she was always looking over her shoulder, trying to assess if there was any danger or anybody that looked a bit sus. So that's the first type of work-related cause. So they want to exclude, they want to discriminate against people who have been exposed to trauma at work. The other common thing is a repeated pattern of bullying and harassment by other workers or by management. It's funny, there's a big campaign for zero tolerance of bullying in schools, in the community. But workers who suffer bullying and harassment at work, usually we're talking about repeated, not just usually one-off things, they're going to be excluded, or the government wanted to exclude them from workers' compensation. People who've been repeated pattern of bullying and harassment, anxiety, bouts of depression, avoidance, loss of self-confidence and self-belief. So both these types of injuries, these psychological injuries, can have a devastating and a major negative impact on a person's life. PTSD doesn't heal. There's no cure for it. You can give people drugs or you can help them manage it, but once you've got it, you've got it. Bullying and harassment can drive people to suicide. We've seen it in schools. I've seen it in the workplace. And it destroys, if you continually being bullied and harassed at work, it destroys your self-confidence, your self-belief, that strong centre that we need to function properly. So that's the background to psychological injury. Now, what's the government want to do? In the original legislation, the government was proposing that workers who suffer a psychological injury would be taken out of the workers' compensation system and have to argue their case in the arbitration commission against the lawyers of the employer. So it was basically, instead of a health issue, an injury, a compensation issue, it was sort of like a conflict between the employer and the worker, and they had to argue it out in the arbitration commission.
PTSD just from that. Just...
An outrageous proposal. The government eventually had to drop, but they wanted to do it because they realised there was no way they could get it through the upper house where the Greens and Independents held the balance of power. And of course, Trades Hall, called now Unions New South Wales, kicked up a stink as well. So, they backtracked. The Premier and his government then proposed that workers with a psychological impairment would have to reach a threshold of over 30% whole body impairment in order to qualify for a lump sum compensation from the insurer. The old level was 15%. You had to reach that, and it would continue with physical injuries. So they bumped it up. You had to be 30% whole body impaired, which is, I've never seen anybody reach that unless they're in a wheelchair or crippled or whatever. The usual whole body impairment figures between 15 and 20%. So basically, no worker with a psychological injury would qualify for a lump sum compensation payment. Experts, lawyers and mental health professionals all agreed that it was very unlikely any worker would reach the 30% threshold. And very interestingly, if you don't reach the whole body impairment threshold, it was 15%, psychological injuries 30%, you can't sue the employer for negligence. So that cuts off a whole stream of rights. In addition, the insurer would only have to pay 75% of the psychological injured worker's salary while determining liability, which can take up to 2 to 3 months. Normally it's mandatory when you put in a workers' comp claim, even when they're considering it, for the liability, you get paid your salary. So, but not the psychological injury, you go to 75%, which can be a big drop for people that are struggling to survive on their, disability workers' salary or whatever. And it also there's time limits put on how much you can get weekly benefits and how long you can access medical treatment. I think up to a year from memory. So again, previously that was determined clinically by psychologists, psychiatrists writing reports. Now there was a cut-off point for the psychologically injured. What happened next? The upper house of Parliament sent the new legislation to a committee to examine and hold hearings and take submissions from the public. While this was occurring, the government introduced the same legislation in a new bill. I don't really understand that. So they just put a new bill, which got through the lower house, of course, because Labor has the majority there. I'm not sure what's happened to it. But as far as I know, this is the current state of affairs. The bills to discriminate, to exclude the psychologically injured are stuck in the upper house committee, and they've taken public submissions, etc. So we have to ask, what's behind all this? The government says the workers' comp system is financially unsustainable. Really? The three main insurers, QBE, have a guess what their profit after tax in 2024 was? 1.799 billion. Allianz, which is a multinational, their profit, and a big insurer in the workers' comp system, 16 billion euros was their profit after tax, euros. EML, which only does workers' comp in New South Wales, so it's not a big company, that made 14.4 million just from its... So, yeah, the workers' comp system's unsustainable. Comrades, we need to lift the lid and see what forces are active beneath the surface. Three things. Firstly, workers who suffer a psychological injury or damage to their mental health are seen as inferior, weak, inadequate, or deceptive, putting it on. An easy target. And that's traditionally often in workplaces, people that go off with PTSD or bullying and harassment, they're seen as weak, as not being able to stand up for themselves, or they can't, what's that expression, they have to get out of the kitchen because they can't stand the heat. Imagine if we said that to school kids. No wonder many of them suicide. As I said, the government encourages zero tolerance for bullying. Schools, in the wider community, yet proposing to persecute and discriminate against those that suffer bullying and harassment at work. But, you know, it's an easy target. It's an easy target. Secondly, workers are divided. The physically injured are divided from the psychologically injured. The two groups are pitted against one another, because one's going to get a lot more out of the workers' comp system than the other. Division, as opposed to a united working class, is always an important goal in our economic system, capitalism. For the capitalists, the united working class is scary. Remember the old May Day chant, the workers united can never be defeated. Always there's an attempt to divide workers. The anti-immigration rallies, for example, what do? They divide migrant workers. They're aimed at dividing migrant workers from other workers. Divide and conquer. But the third thing, and perhaps most importantly, we have to ask the question, on whose behalf does the government govern? The workers' compensation system in New South Wales is a privatised system. As we know, where a number of private insurance companies, just outlined them, EML, QBE, Allianz, run the show. And the government regularly tops them up with public money. But it does that all along. In the energy companies, etc. Always they top them up with public money. Building companies, they give them grants to build 10% affordable homes in their billion-dollar developments. So the insurers, like all capitalist enterprises, their aim is profit and more profit. That's their aim, that's why they're in business. We can't blame them, that's why they're there. If the government can legislate to exclude or decrease payments to a large number of the injured workers, and we're talking about quite a large number of injured workers with these psychologically injured people from trauma, from bullying and harassment, then profits go up. It's natural. Furthermore, the insurers were also threatening to increase the premiums for employers. Well, the government couldn't have that. The insurers have to, the employers having to pay higher insurance premiums. But remember, if your workers' comp claims go up, insurance premiums can go up too. So you're motivated to do something about your unsafe work environment. You have to try and tackle it's money. You have to try and tackle bullying and harassment. You have to try and tackle unsafe work conditions. But here, no increase in premiums. I looked at who were the supporters of the legislation, apart from the Labor government. The usual suspects, Business Council, insurance industry, etc. But interestingly, the welfare arms of many church or community organisations. And I thought, why is that? You know, Baptist Care, Anglicare. And then I realised many of them run NDIS services, aged care services, disability services. And I know from my experience, I also looked at the statistics, they have very high levels of bullying and harassment in these organisations. So they've got an incentive to want the psychologically injured excluded. But comrades, I think we can see the priority. Not the injured worker, but rather the smooth running of the capitalist economic system. What is to be done? Unions, New South Wales, have campaigned against the changes. They've put some ads in the paper. They've submission to the Upper House inquiry. They've had a number of rallies around the place in Wollongong, Newcastle, Parramatta, outside Parliament House. They've had to. The changes are so outrageous. But we know the Union New South Wales are welded onto the Labor Party. An important function of the Labor Party under capitalism is to control the working class. So there's no strong talk of strikes or industrial action or marches in the streets or mobilising all unions to act together. Remember, Unions New South Wales do not offer a lot of support to the rail workers when they were attempting to get a fair pay rise to compensate them for the years of falling real wages. They didn't mobilise all unions in support of the rail workers. That would smack too much of class consciousness, a commie term. At the end of the day, Unions New South Wales, I think, can say, we tried, comrades, but. So I don't think we can put a lot of faith in Unions New South Wales actually taking any decisive action on this. The Law Society, Dora, they oppose the legislation, but I'm not aware that they are activists. The Greens and some independents are blocking the legislation in the upper house, as I said. They've sent it to a committee. But these groups are no great friends to the working class, and I suspect they'll allow some half-baked compromise to be passed that will still disadvantage psychologically injured workers. So you send it to a committee, and committee's about sort of some compromise. Oh, we'll take this little bit off here, and we'll accept this bit. I think that's what will come from the committee recommendations. They haven't delivered them yet. So what can Eureka do? This is our organisation here. The organisation was set up to defend the basic needs of the working class, and surely a safe workplace and proper assistance to injured workers, whether the injury is physical or psychological, is something we should take up. We aim to develop both class consciousness among workers. Their fight is our fight. Our two aims: class consciousness among workers, their fight is our fight, and to draw other sections of society into the struggle. Students, sections of the middle class, etc. But we're a small group. We don't have the status or support of unions. The ALP has the union movement sewn up at the present time. But at Eureka we're trying to follow the words of the song, from little things, big things grow. Our website is important, especially in reaching young people. It needs to be dynamic and user-friendly. And we can put on our website just what's happening in an attempt to reach people, to get them to make some commitment to working with us, working together to oppose these changes. Street work's very important, whether it's outside the insurance company offices, as Dorothy proposed, or in areas where people congregate or pass by. Handing out leaflets and having a petition people can sign. A petition, it's some sort of class consciousness because other unaffected workers sign it. They're signing it and saying, we support the psychologically injured. Just as with our rail worker petitions, they're signing it and saying their fight is our fight. And also, of course, it draws in other sections of society. So you get students, young people, middle class people signing the petition. That's been my experience anyway. But it's very difficult to get beyond that, to get those people to come along to a rally or demo. The people that come to any rallies or protests we have are usually already converted. It's very hard to get the people that might sign the petition to come along. However, I think we are neglecting a tactic in that area. As a group, and with any supporters we can muster from our street work. A lot of people don't want to go along to things because they don't know anybody there. They feel a bit shy, or they feel a bit, uncomfortable. So we should march as Eureka to join any organised rallies, and we invite our supporters who signed the petition to come along to that, to meet with us, and then we go to the rally. I think that happened at a nurses' rally once outside in Sydney. But I'm talking about not just go along in dribs and drabs. We have our flag, and we actually go, I'll use the word march, go as a group. And here, Eureka is supporting this rally, and people and workers can see that. And we're trying to bring other people other than just nurses or rail workers or the psychologically injured to these rallies. Very important. But it requires a bit of organisation. We can't just turn up like Brown's cows at something. I always remember I've been to rallies where union groups or other groups have assembled away from the rally and marched to the rally. It had a big impact, and they're often chanting something, or they had their flag. Here comes the cavalry, so to speak. But Eureka, maybe we're not in that league, but I think it's an important thing we should sort of look at. Other things, there's a parliamentary inquiry. Should Eureka make a submission to it? As I said, I'm not sure what that's going to achieve, or whether it's relevant to our goals. The The other thing people have said to me, patients, you know, we need a rally of the psychologically injured workers. Very hard because most people, it's private. It's, these people are isolated. So there are some groups of, I know for physically injured workers on the internet. It's worth considering, but I'm not too sure in my own mind how it would actually work. But the psychologically injured people are very upset about this latest development. Because as I said, discriminates against them. It makes them feel inferior, that there's something inadequate about them. They're not good enough to receive the full benefits that other workers, the physically injured worker, can have. So, comrades, that's the presentation. Some suggestions, I think, the two suggestions I favour is the website, and we've recently tried to renovate the website and make it a bit more dynamic and appealing. And it'll be published on Tuesday, the new Eureka website, and it'll have our current campaigns, how to contact us, etc. And it'll also have a drop-down page for these presentations as well. But the other important thing is street work. We can have a talk here, but what are we, 7 people already? We're speaking to the converted. It's important. It's good that people, all of us, need to be aware of these matters. And we learned something, just as we learned something from the bullying talk, from the talk on education, from Stratus's talks on the international situation. We learned something. That's good. But for me, street work is very important. And that idea, I think the idea of, as a group, and with the supporters that we can muster from our petitions, our street work, marching to existing organised rallies, very important, I think. Anyway, thanks, comrades.